Hi and welcome into another video. Today we'll be talking about one of the AWS serverless offerings, which is a Lambda function. Let's hop into AWS and talk a little bit more about that. Alright, so we are in our AWS console and I will navigate through search bar to Lambda. Run code without thinking about servers. So Lambda is called a serverless offering. So what is serverless? Actually, it doesn't mean that there are no servers at all. It will mean that you don't need to think about the infrastructure at all. So all the servers where this code runs are operated and managed by AWS. Lambda is a very useful tool for creating a little codes or a little functions that will do some stuff. So let's maybe hop into creating a function in our sandbox environment, and we have three different approaches. So either we can author from scratch and start with a simple hello world example. Either we can use a blueprint and we can choose from some of the blueprints already created, like batch jobs, some stream stuff, hello functions as well, some HTTP requests, S3 connections, and so on. And we can upload a container. So those are basic three things. Let's go and author from scratch. We will create a very basic, briefly, Lambda. Then we can choose a runtime. So you can choose through many different programming languages. It can be Node, it can be Python, Ruby, Java, Net, and so on, and also older versions if you need to. You can choose architecture. We will stick with x86, and some permissions for the CloudWatch logs. So by default, Lambda throws its log to CloudWatch logs, and it is very useful to track the invocations of Lambda, how many resources it used, if there were any errors, how much time it took, and so on. So we will leave the default execution role, and in advanced settings there are four options. Code signing will be used for signing code so that we can know that it wasn't altered. Tags, self-explanatory, we can add tags. And two things we will talk about more. So enable function URL. That is a very useful thing. We'll see it later. We'll be able to create a Lambda function with a public URL already put outside so that we can get to this function, or we can enable VPC. That we'll talk also in the configure option, but I will let you know right now that by default Lambda is deployed in a AWS native VPC and it has access to the internet. But if you want to use some private resources, then you would deploy it in a VPC. Let's create a function. And while it's creating, let's talk about some limitations. So by default, you can launch up to 1000 Lambda functions concurrently. Besides that, the size of the function itself. So you can do it in three different manners, the Lambda code. You can either write it here directly in this code source, as we can see here, or you can upload a zip file from your local computer or take it from S3. Then you have a limitation of 50 megs for the zip and 250 megs. The whole function can be in unzipped. And the third option is to launch a Docker container where there is no limit. So this is on that. What other limits we have? We have a limit on a payload. So if you would launch Lambda function to process some, let's say, HTTP requests, and you would like to send some kind of a payload to this function, the limit for this payload using it synchronously would be 6 megabytes. In asynchronous call, it can be 256 kilo, and let's say if your payload is too big, you would be able to, let's say, throw some kind of a message which would be a reference to some object stored in S3 or in database, and then you would be able to pick up that from S3 and make your payload as big as possible. So that would be also it. And the next thing is that time which it can run. So it is a hard limit of 900 seconds, so 15 minutes. So if you need to create something that will take more time than 15 minutes, Lambda is not something that will be suitable for you. So we already launched our very basic one, and we can see what options we have here. So here is a basic hello world, so it just returns a status code of 200 and the body from hello from Lambda. We can test it locally and do some create a new event, and let's call it a test event, and we don't need to send anything in payload, so let's just save it and let's invoke this test event. So we can go here to tests and we can launch our test, and we will see execution function status. Either it will be a succeed or a failed one, and here you will get some basic data. So this is the payload which we got from the Lambda itself: initiation time, build duration, max memory used, resources configured, execution time, and so on. All the things you can find in CloudWatch logs. So let's stick with that. Let's see some other stuff. So we can see monitoring and get to CloudWatch logs. This would be populated with some invocation, durations, and so on and so on. Let's go to configure and what we can configure. So we can configure memory. I think it's up to 3 gigabytes, some ephemeral storage, and the timeout. We have it set for 3 seconds, but as I mentioned, you can put it up to 15. Triggers, another great thing about Lambda. So Lambda can be triggered with multiple AWS services. I think it's around 200 different ones. So we can react to some data being stored in, let's say, DynamoDB. We can react to objects being put in S3. We can react to some SNS notifications, SQS messages queue. We can invoke it from HTTP, which we'll see later, from API gateway, and all other stuff. So it would be just a matter of adding a trigger and selecting a source from a very big list of possible choices. Permissions. So of course we need to attach and create some kind of a Lambda role and give it a roles what AWS resources it can gain access to. So by default we have only CloudWatch logs, which was automatically configured. Another things are like destinations. So what will be the invocations and destination tab, what happens then, configure a destination to receive invocation records. So that would be also it. Function URL, it was something that we didn't apply at first time, so at creating that. So if you would like to use it not from a trigger from AWS service, we can use it for, let's say, API gateway. But there is also a very basic solution here that we can create a function URL, and we can choose here out type. We'll set it to no. It will create a public endpoint which everyone can access, and some advanced settings that we will not talk today. So let's save that, and it will create ourselves a function URL. And let's click this function URL and see we are getting the same payload. So hello from Lambda, from a Lambda URL, and it's a public one which you can share with anyone. So that's it. And what else? Environment variables. Lambda can have its own environment variables, or from inside Lambda you can access through AWS SDK some secrets in parameter store or secrets manager. Tags are self-explanatory, like name, environment or whatever. VPC, we didn't do that, but we are mentioned that briefly before. So by default, this Lambda is outside of our VPS in AWS managed VPC, and it has access to internet. But if we would like to point to some private resources in our private network, then we would need to deploy this Lambda in our VPC. It can also have access to our databases, and it can be easily set through the management console, and then some asynchronous invocation, and you can see that maximum H events, retry and attempts, and that level queue services are here. So this is about asynchronous processing of Lambda. So let's say we would invoke it from a SQS queue, and then what happens? Do we implement some kind of a dead letter queue, which would be used for storing unprocessed events, and so on and so on. Code signing, we are talking about that before very briefly, and some file system data if we would like to use this Lambda with connection to some kind of a EFS file system in our account for storing some shared data. So you can also use aliases so that we don't need to use a very big arn of this function and this dynamic name which we have here, but we can store some kind of aliases, and this is also useful for deployments of new Lambda, that we can deploy a new Lambda, and then let's say we want to do some checking, blue-green deployment, and so on and so on, and then after everything seems good, we are just switching beneath the alias name, so it points to the new Lambda, not to the old version. So that gives a very brief overview of the Lambda. We will for sure talk a lot about Lambda in the future and use it in some architecture. So that will be all for today, and see ya in another one.